Good morning. Welcome to ACC CAM Certification Preparation Program in association with the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists, ACAMS. Today we'll be covering chapters 3 and 4, which is the AML compliance program and conducting and supporting the investigation process. As we are used that every day, we start with a quick revision on the topic that we've covered the last time. And we start by taking your questions. So if you have any question on the international standards on money laundering compliance. Anybody got a chance to go through the materials? The book? Okay. Okay, any questions? Yeah.
Actually, there is a topic about the World Bank and IMF on the material. So, is that also important?
It is, yeah, but I mean, when we do the slides, we do like the most important thing that the thing that needs to be summarized in bullet points and so on. But of course, as I said, you cannot rely on the presentation alone. You always have to go through the book. But the thing that we find that it cannot be summarized, you need to go through it completely, so we don't include it in the slide. But in the slide, we just put the important things that you need to focus on, and it can be summarized in a different manner of the book. So that's why you need to study the book from leaflet to leaflet. Don't leave anything. Any topic that you will leave, you will find it in the exam.
So that's why we were asking.
Yeah.
Since it was not covered, I was
Yeah.
unaware whether it is important or
It is. Yeah, it is. Great. So let me have a quick overview of what we have covered last time. So we spoke about the international standards of money laundering, and we spoke about the FATF, and we mentioned that FATF is incorporated in 1989 in Paris, and the members here are countries. Okay. The members of the FATF are countries. Okay, and we mentioned we currently have 37 countries, and the main objective of the FATF is?
By the way, there is a mistake in the book regarding the members.
Okay.
Because they wrote
34,
something about
maybe?
the GCC,
Uh-huh.
that all the GCC countries are only under the GCC, but Saudi Arabia now is a member, so it's not stated there.
I see, yeah, okay.
There is a
Maybe.
mistake.
No, maybe because when we issue the book, it takes time for review. So maybe during this gap, things have changed. It was not updated. Yeah, of course. Sure, no worries. So the main objective of the FATF is spreading the AML message, and we mentioned that the FATF issues recommendations, and we mentioned that these recommendations, as such, are not mandatory, except for members, or as Mr. Abdurrahim mentioned also, if you are a member through any FSRB or OGBS. So if you have any membership with any sort in the FATF, then it becomes mandatory. And we mentioned that.
one more
Sure.
additional point in the material they mentioned about they are the members of the World Bank or the IMF which are supporting through financially or other means to the country,
Right.
and they are also being asked to follow
The 40 recommendation. That's right. So those who are not, it's not like mandatory for them, the countries that have nothing to do at all with FATF. So, and we mentioned that what's mandatory for the member countries are the recommendations, not anything else, not the typologies, not the papers, not any guidance, except the recommendations. We mentioned that the FATF is an intergovernmental body whose objective is the development of national and international standards to fight money laundering and terrorism financing. And we mentioned now that we currently have 40 recommendations to fight money laundering and to fight terrorism financing. We no longer have the 40 plus 9. We mentioned after that the FATF have specified the financial institutions, and we mentioned that any institution offering certain services will be considered as a financial institution, like accepting of deposit, lending, you forgot? Investment, life insurance or other investment-related insurance, financial guarantees, issuance of means of payment, right? Like traveler checks, like stored value cards, prepaid access, right? These will be considered financial institutions. We spoke also about the DNFBBs, designated non-financial business and professions, and we gave examples. Can you give me some examples? Casinos. Huh?
Law firms.
Lawyers, notaries, accountants, which is gatekeepers. Dealers in precious metals and stones. TCSPs, trust and company service providers, right? Of course, as we mentioned, this is not an exhaustive list, but we mentioned that this is just some examples. So most important to know, if they ask you in the exam, which of the following are financial institutions or DNFBBs, you need to check each and every option, which will have more than one institution. And you need to make sure that if we're asking about financial institution, that any institution in this option will be offering any kind of financial services. And we mentioned that insurance companies, only they are considered financial institutions only if they offer investment-related insurance products, including, of course, life insurance. But if it's a fidelity insurance, car insurance, fire insurance, any kind of insurance which is purely depending on covering the risk, then in this case, doesn't have any investment part, doesn't have a fund, then in this case it's not a financial institution, it's DNFB. Yeah, question? Okay. So then we mentioned that the FATF also have specified the categories of offenses, the categories of predicate crimes, and we mentioned that you do not need to study this, but you need to know that whenever you do any crime, you will get one crime free at least. So fraud, terrorism, piracy, any kind of crimes will result in money laundering.
So again, coming back to the insurance part of it, just wanted to confirm, like insurance and this offering or covering you for health, fire, things like that, property damage or whatever. That is going to be under DNFBB?
DNFBB if no fund is involved, if no investment related. Exactly. Just coverage. If it's pure coverage, then it's DNFBB. If it includes any investment part, like a fund or
Cashback or something?
yeah, something like when it involves any investment related part, then in this case it's a financial institution.
Because today, there are a lot of insurance policies which not just provide you a coverage, but also give you a sort of a cashback or an investment return.
Yeah, that means it's backed by investment. Yeah, of course. That means they need to grow the money. They can give you something at the end. So once it involves any investment part, then in this case it's a financial institution. Sure.
There is a question that we went through regarding, according to the FATF 40 recommendations, the threshold for identifying occasional customers at financial institution is 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. Last time you said the correct answer is B, which is 10,000.
No, as per it is 15,000.
It's 15,000.
15,000,
Yeah.
but I think on that day we are confused with the directives, EU
Yeah.
directives.
Yeah,
FATF.
directives is 10, this one is 15.
50.
15.
No, you said the correct answer is B,
Did I?
which is
Yeah,
10.
you told us it's 10.
Yeah, B.
As per-
Actually, that is.
The directives is 10.
Directive is 10,
Yeah.
but FATF is 15.
It's
No.
15. Yeah, I'll reach that.
No, the answer, you said it's B. I know it's 15, but then
Yeah.
You said
when
because
you said it's B,
Study.
10,000 because there was a change or
Amendment.
something in the threshold.
Let me.
When I went to chapter 6
Mhm.
to answer the questions,
Mhm.
question number 39 is exactly the same question. And I answered B and then I got it wrong when I checked with the answer, so it's 15. So now I need to know which one is the right.
No, it should be 15. The European directive is 10. So that's
No,
FATF is 15.
FATF 15. European directive is 10. US is 10.
but then the answer is not B. Then
It should be C then.
yeah.
Hold on.
You get
Which
it?
question? Number what?
No. In the presentation.
Yeah, give me the question number.
The 10. It's here 10.
Question number 10. Okay, just let me go through it.
Last.
Yeah, last time when we got through that one,
Yeah.
yes.
He
I-
said it's B, which is 10,000.
This one, right?
Yeah.
Yes. What's
Yeah.
the answer
It
here?
should be 15. 15.
So, just go
But you
over.
reason-
What did you say?
No, maybe
Yes.
we're confused by the European.
Because the
directive.
same question is it's in chapter 6.
Okay, in the
Question
exact.
number 39.
Okay.
And I answered, so now I have 78.
Okay, that's good. But you need to score 9, as I told you.
So the FATF
I
threshold
need
didn't
90.
change.
The FATF is 15.
Didn't
Yeah,
change.
Madam is
Yeah.
90
So
Yeah.
it's 15. That's
Yeah,
all.
European directives US is 10.
So it's,
So see, even myself I can get confused.
you got confused?
Yeah.
You confused us? Thank you.
No, no.
أي صفحة أي سلايد
Question number 10.
To 18. Slide 218 and the slides here. Go back. You will find it. Question number 10. The answer should be C, not B.
15, yeah. Great. So then we spoke about Basel Committee, and we mentioned that Basel is established in 1974. Okay. The members here are central bank governors and or heads of supervisory authorities in countries where central bank does not have a formal supervisory role. Okay. What is the objective of Basel Committee? So we mentioned it is risk management, banking operations, and they need to ensure two important things. Do you remember them? First is ensuring the safety and soundness of the financial system and the integrity of the financial system. These two things are very important. Integrity, yeah. That's why I'm stressing on it. The integrity of the financial system and the safety and soundness of the financial system. That's right. Then we mentioned, as per the latest paper of 2016 for Basel, we mentioned that there are more than one line of defense. Do you remember them? The first line of defense is the business, the frontliners. Then AML, compliance. Second line of defense. 3, audit. Excellent. So 3 lines of defenses. And we mentioned that the main elements of Basel KYC are the basic elements. What are the elements of Basel KYC? Customer acceptance, customer identification, ongoing monitoring, and risk management. Yeah? Perfect. And we mentioned that you cannot get to suspicious unless you get to unusual, and you cannot know what's unusual unless you know your customer. Excellent. Then we mentioned that the CDD as per Basel should be conducted on any person or entity, okay, maintaining a relation with the bank, not just an account, a relation with the bank, and on those on whose behalf intermediaries are operating. So we need to identify also the UBO, or the ultimate beneficial owner. We also need to know any person or any entity connected with the financial transaction, right? So that's part of Basel due diligence. Then we spoke about the KYC procedure should incorporate 4 things. Okay? Remember that? Okay. So, routines for management oversight, systems and controls, segregation of duties, training and policies. In the internal audit, why is it important? It independently evaluates the effectiveness of the risk management and controls of the AML CTF program, and we mentioned that no program is complete without independent assessment. Remember? Yes. So, what are the 5 elements of the AML program?
5 pillars.
5 pillars? Huh? Designation of an officer, policies, procedures, and controls, training and awareness, independent assessment, or audit, board of director oversight. Excellent. Then we spoke about Egmont Group, and we mentioned the Egmont Group is a group of financial intelligence units. Excellent. And it expands and systemizes cooperation in reciprocal exchange of information, which we'll be discussing today in more details in conducting and supporting the investigation part. Then increasing the effectiveness of FIUs by offering training and promoting personnel exchanges to improve the expertise and capabilities of personnel employed by FIUs, better communication, promoting operational autonomy of FIUs, and promoting the establishment of FIUs in conjunction with jurisdictions with an AML CFT program in place or in areas where the program is in early stages of development. Then we spoke about the European directives, and we mentioned that the member countries here are the European Union countries, and we mentioned that the directives supersede the local laws, so they are more enforceable. Yeah, they have more primacy over local laws. And is it mandatory? Yes, it's mandatory for the European Union countries, but not mandatory for the rest of the world. And we mentioned that the important elements of the EU directives are 4 elements. Knowledge, scope of the predicate crimes have expanded, money remitters, and lawyers, notaries, or the gatekeepers. Okay, perfect. Then we spoke about the Wolfsburg Group, and we mentioned that the Wolfsburg Group, when it was established, 2000, the members are the largest 13 banks. Okay, and their objective is to, what their objective of Wolfsburg Group? Perfect. And they issue 2 types of documents. They issue principles and they issue statements. And we mentioned that the principles, 2 principles, private banking and correspondent banking. The rest are statements like the suppression of terrorism financing, monitoring, screening, and searching. We spoke about as well guidance on risk-based approach, if you remember this slide. Okay, so we have, as we mentioned, the principles, private banking and correspondent banking, and those are statements. Then they defined the UBO, or the ultimate beneficial owner, and we mentioned that the UBO, as per Wolfsburg, is the recognition that a person on whose name an account is opened with a bank is not necessarily the person who ultimately controls such funds or who ultimately is entitled to such funds. Yeah? Then we spoke about the US Patriot Act, and we mentioned that it is the act uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. Okay? And then we mentioned the important sections that we need to know. Section 311, special measures. Section 312, CDD, EDD for foreign correspondent account, private banking accounts. Section 313, prohibition of correspondent accounts for shell banks. Section 314A, sharing information between government and FIs. 314, voluntary sharing of information between financial institutions. 319A, forfeiture from U.S. correspondent accounts. Section 319B, records related to correspondent accounts of foreign banks. And we also added Section 317, which is the U.S. long arm law. Okay, so far so good? Perfect.
Long arm is the same one that we talked about, I think, in the first session, wherein they have authority over different jurisdictions to, stop this.
Yeah, the U.S. long arm law. Yeah, exactly. Then we made a summary of this whole chapter, and we mentioned that this slide is really very important. So it shows the group, the members, important documents, topics, and whether it's mandatory or not. So as we can see, the only thing which is mandatory only for the European Union countries is the EU directives. Okay? So far so good? Shall we move to our topic of today? Great. Okay, so today we'll be discussing Money Laundering Compliance Program, Section 3, and that covers 35% of the exam. So that's the most important chapter, 35% of the exam. So
How much percentage for passing percentage?
75, 100, 75%. Yeah. Okay?
What is it about the 90? You said something 90.
Yeah, I mentioned that in the mock exam, you need to score 90% or above. Why is that? Because when you score 90%, when the score that you score when you are at home, you normally can score anywhere up to 15% less. So if you score 90, let's take the worst case scenario that you will score in the exam, the worst thing, which is 15% less, at 75, that means you're still passing. So, but if you score 78, you may pass, you may not. 80, you may pass, you may not. But when you score 90 and above, that means your level is very high. Even in the worst case scenario, if you score 15% less, which is the worst case, you still are passing your CAMS exam. Okay, so great. Okay. So any question, anything not clear in the topics that we have covered? So shall we move to the money laundering compliance program? Okay. So an effective AML program should encompass 3 key goals. So I mentioned here key goals. That means these are not all the goals, but these are 3 key goals. If I want to just have a quick look over the AML program in any organization, any financial institution, first of all, I will ask myself one major question. What is the purpose of the AML program? Why is it there? It is to prevent money laundering and detect money laundering cases. So any program that does not prevent or detect money laundering is useless. It's as simple as this. That's why we mentioned evaluate the results. Is the program achieving its good results or no? So I'm having a program to prevent and detect money laundering. Is it doing so or no? So the first and the major objective of any AML program when I design it, it should be designed to prevent and detect money laundering and terrorism financing activities. If it failed to do so, I don't need to look further. What is the whole purpose of an AML program that does not prevent money laundering or detect it? Then in this case, it has no value. The second thing is to be able to report suspicious activity and transactions to the proper authorities, which is in the United States, FinCEN, Financial Crime Enforcement Network. So as I was giving you an example, I believe in day one, I mentioned that there were AML monitoring systems in the market that don't have a reporting module. So you can detect, you can investigate, and that's it. The major part is the reporting part as well. So any AML program should have three main sections: detect, investigate, report. So report is the end result, because we mentioned that AML or money laundering is a legal risk. And how can you mitigate a legal risk? By reporting. So at the end of the day, if you fail to report, that means you did not mitigate the risk. So the major objective here is to report suspicious transactions and activities to the proper authorities. And any program, especially the AML one, as we mentioned, the first line of defense is the business. And we mentioned that compliance is everybody's responsibility. That means without proper training, I am missing out on my first line of defense. I'm missing out maybe on my second line of defense, even if my own compliance team are not properly trained. So training is an essential part of the AML program. So any AML program, I need to look at three key objectives: to prevent, detect money laundering and terrorism financing, to report suspicious activity and transaction to their respective authorities. In this case, in the United States, it's FinCEN, and to train all pertinent employees that are responsible to carry out this program. So these are the main goals. Are these the only goals? Of course not. There are lots of other goals, but these are the key goals. If these goals are not achieved, then the AML program should not be satisfactory. I will never issue a satisfactory report for an AML program that does not include training, that does not report suspicious transactions, that does not prevent and detect money laundering and terrorism financing. Yeah.
How to measure this?
How to measure this goal? I look at, for example, the quality of the SARS, right? The quality of the alerts, the quality of the scenarios that they have, their proper KYC. As we mentioned, you cannot get to suspicious unless you get to unusual. You cannot know what's unusual unless you know your customer. So for example, if you have poor KYC, that will end up that you will not be able to prevent and detect money laundering because you don't know your customer. So that's why, as I said, each one of those will encompass lots and lots of checks to be able to say that, yes, this program is really preventing and detecting money laundering. So I need to look at the...
In case we have an AML program,
Yeah.
a country, let's say if we go to the Europeans,
Yeah.
they have already AML programs and everything.
Right.
But when there is one terrorist act, how does this affect their programs?
As we mentioned, we cannot prevent and detect 100%. Yes. Let's be clear about that. But is my control satisfactory or not? And that's why, as I said, 75% of the fines are due to one reason: lack of control. So your controls are not satisfactory. Not because you've done a mistake. You could do a mistake and you may not get fined. And you may not do a mistake, but your controls are weak and you will get fined. Okay? The best example, as I mentioned in the beginning, is American Express, that was fined $65 million because their risk matrix was not up to date. There were certain customers that were supposed to be classified as high risk, and the enhanced due diligence should be applied on them. That was not done. And the bank did not comply with the bank's internal policies and procedures. So those two major things. Of course, the third thing is also lack of identification of the UBO, because they did not know who are the ultimate beneficiaries of the bearer shares. So in this case, these three elements caused the bank to be fined $65 million fine by the US Department of Treasury. Whereas another bank, you could find another bank really having mistakes, or there could be maybe even a money laundering or terrorism financing activity, but it was there was nothing could be done, like the controls were perfect. In this case, the bank may not get fined. So when I assess the bank, I mainly assess the controls of the bank. As I mentioned, when do we have zero money laundering? When we have zero transactions. So I cannot just ask the bank to have zero money laundering, but I need to ask the bank to have proper, effective controls in place to be able to fight money laundering and terrorism financing. So that's why we look at the KYC. And as I said, when I look at the KYC, I look at the customer acceptance, I look at the customer identification procedures, I look at their monitoring, I look at the risk management. That's all under KYC. Then I need to look at the alert definitions, the scenarios that they have in place. I need to look at their customer grouping and peer grouping. I need to look at their customer risk assessment. I need to look at how effective they are in disposing of alerts. Like, for example, you got an alert today. What is the aging of the alert? How long the alert stays without being looked at? Is there any alert staying more than 1 week without being looked at or no? I need to look at their case, investigation case, how they handle the case, how they gather information. If everything in order, that means you should end up with strong controls that are able to prevent, detect, and report suspicious transactions. So, in a nutshell, these are the three main objectives, but under this, you could spend lots and lots of time and lots of audit procedures or examination procedures to reach to whether these are available or not.
No, I'm just commenting on this because this is going to be applied during our NRA and mutual evaluation.
Right.
This is one of the
Yeah.
main topics.
Sure. Yeah. So the question here, how to meet these key goals. So I've set these goals. Everything is perfect. How to meet the goals. To meet these key goals, we have something called the basic W's. And these are 4 major questions that we ask. Of course, there can be more questions. But these are the main questions that I would ask myself when I design the AML program. Of course, when I design the AML program, as I mentioned, one size does not fit all. So I cannot just, copy and paste an AML program from another financial institution, and I expect it to work. No, I need to design my own AML program to make sure that it is achieving this objective. So the 4 major questions is who, what, where, and whom. So who's the audience your AML program will affect? So who's your audience? Right? Who are the people who should be aware or implement this AML program?
Financial institutions.
Yep. Which type of financial institution? Is it an investment bank? Is it a commercial bank? Is it an insurance company? Is it a telecom company? Is it an MSB? So who are the audience? Right? Great. So second thing is what? What products and services does this financial institution offer? Based on the products and services that you're offering, the program should be different. Right? Where are these products and services offered? Where are you offering it? High-risk countries, locally, internationally? Whom are these products and services offered to? Who are your customers? High-risk customers, non-resident customers, or non-resident aliens, resident customers, which type of customers? So all these are major elements that would affect my design for the AML program. And of course, we should not forget the major element, which is management approval and involvement is so crucial. Why? Because, as we mentioned, your role as an AML officer is to guide, monitor, and report. So who's having the executive part? It is management. Without management support, compliance will not take place. Right? So management approval and involvement is so crucial, and that's why we highlighted the importance of the board of director oversight, because the board of director, they will set the framework and the executive management will execute this framework. So the AML CTF risk levels are, as we mentioned, we have 4 main levels. Prohibited, that means the risk here is above or beyond my risk appetite. I cannot accept this customer. So in this case, there will not be a customer acceptance. That means we will reject or decline the relationship from the beginning. Then we have high-risk customers. Although they are high risk, but they are within my risk appetite, that means I can still accept them. But of course, being high risk, I need to apply EDD, enhanced due diligence. Then you have the moderate risk customers, where we apply the normal due diligence or the CDD. Then you have low risk customers, where we apply the SDD or simplified due diligence or basic KYC. And we mentioned that this category is exclusive for government organizations only. Yep.
What about the bank perspective or the international perspective toward how often these checks need to be? If we don't have any alert, usually a customer will be under, you need to have continuous customer due diligence. Isn't
Of course.
How often you will do it? Or based on what?
Okay. As I said, you start your due diligence when you establish the relation. As far as the relation is active, your due diligence should be ongoing. No, it should be ongoing. Meaning, if you got any information or any reason to update, you need to update instantly. If you don't have, you need to make a periodic review for your customers and for your risk rating as well. Risk rating is something which should be done more than once a year. So some banks do it quarterly, semi-annually, but it cannot be more than this because you need to make sure that your risk assessment is up to date. Because if you have a not up to date risk matrix, then all your system will operate in a wrong manner. The risk, yeah, at least twice a year or quarterly, so 4 times a year. Yes. Minimum twice a year. So semi-annual, or you need to do it quarterly. The best practice. Best practice. The international banks, the big banks, are following this.
And who is responsible to change the risk rating for each?
AML, the risk management also, they should be involved because as I...
First line is the officer, the compliance officer?
The AML officer should review the risk matrix and update it if it requires any updation.
So, we understand under prohibited, you most likely have terrorist organizations, sanctioned banned outfits.
Yeah.
You know.
Not only that, like for example, as I said, let's take Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia cannot open any relation for a non-resident. That's a prohibited customer. Just being a non-resident, you are prohibited. You do not need to be on a sanction list. So the prohibition here is not just the sanction. Sanction list is there, I agree with you, but not only sanction list. So in Saudi Arabia, if you are not resident, that will make you a prohibited customer.
Will you be able to give some more examples of what a prohibited customer would be other than, terrorist organization, organized?
I would say very high risk customers above my risk appetite. Like, let's say a high risk nationality, located in a high risk jurisdiction, having a high risk profession, in this case, or being also a private banker, banking client. In this case, all those 4 elements collectively will make it beyond my risk appetite. So in this case, no.
And when you do this change, updating the risk level of any of your businesses or customer,
Right.
It can go.
Yeah, you can, of course, yeah, a customer can go up and down the risk matrix. So either it can be high risk or moderate risk. So it can go up and down the risk matrix. And of course, once he goes up and down, his due diligence accordingly will change. So if he was changed from moderate risk to high risk, the CDD will be moved to EDD. If it's the other way around, then it will be moved from EDD to CDD. I'll give you an example that, for example, at a certain point of time, Libya was on the blacklist, Iran was not. So in this case, automatically, all Libyan customers, you will put them as high risk, and Iranian customers, you put them as moderate risk. Then after that, Libya was taken off the list, Iran was added on the list. Then you need to switch. Now the Libyan customers, we can put them as moderate risk, and the Iranian customer, put them as high risk. Then both of them, again, entered on the list. That means you need to have Libyan and Iranian customers both on high risk. So As I said, this is just an example.
The Iranian now, they have another nationality, so they...
Okay. Another thing, let's say today I'm not having a political position. Tomorrow I started to be a PEP. I started to assume a political position. Then, of course, I need to be moved from a moderate risk to a high risk.
What if the other way happened? You are a PEP, but now...
PEP is always a PEP. So once you are a PEP, you are for the rest of your life a PEP. It's a one-way. Yep. Yeah. It's a one-way. No U-turns. So once you are a PEP... Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Some jurisdiction define that if he holds that position, only then you can categorize it as a PEP.
Yeah, PEP is one of the most difficult areas because there are a lot, even the US itself, they started also changing. And as we mentioned in one of the slides, I mentioned that domestic PEPs are now back as PEPs. Before, so a certain period, they said, no, domestic PEPs are not. Then after that, they said, no, domestic PEPs are PEPs. So there are lots of changes in the definition of the PEP and who's considered as a PEP. And it differs true from one jurisdiction to another.
I don't want to be a PEP.
So since we're talking about the risk classification out here, I wanted to actually understand if this is how it works, because my previous experience, I worked with HSBC where we talked, where the business we conducted was primarily for correspondent banking in the US, and there was a lot of monitoring we did, and there was a international country risk matrix that we were following in terms of doing the risk classification for customers.
Right.
Country risk matrix.
Yeah.
What I believe the international country risk matrix, is quite different to the risk classification we follow here in the UAE. But is that what is also followed as per the FATF standards or as per the curriculum that we are?
When you do risk matrix, not only countries. I would risk rate the jurisdiction or the country. I would risk rate the customer. I would risk rate the product. I would risk rate the delivery channel, and I would risk rate the line of business as well, like private banking versus retail. This is regarding the business jurisdiction, like for example Sudan versus UAE. Customer profession, for example, accountant, which is a gatekeeper, versus let's say a teacher or a student, right? The transaction itself, let's say complicated trade transaction versus let's say internal transfer, for example. Delivery channel, mobile transfer versus face-to-face, or internet transfer versus face-to-face transfer. So you literally are risk rating everything. So it's a complete risk matrix. So as I said, the combination of, let's say, a transaction done by a high-risk customer on a high-risk account, type of transaction is high, right? In a high jurisdiction, it could be rejected because of all this high risks combining in one certain transaction.
Surely.
Right.
My question is very specific to only the country being risk classified.
Right.
Okay, so let's just say we cannot measure Somalia and UAE at the same platform.
Of course, of course.
I mean, one is extremely high risk.
And one could be, for example, let's say moderate risk.
Moderate risk.
Yeah.
So, is there a sort of a reference point, from a curriculum perspective that you would refer to in case there is something, asked us to kind of put down in terms of risk classification purely from a country risk perspective?
Okay, so you're looking at the country risk perspective. What are the sources for you to build the proper risk matrix? I would say the first source will be the blacklist. Okay. So blacklisted countries automatically on the prohibited list. Then there's something we call the gray list, like the high-risk countries who are not blacklisted. Like let's say, for example, Nigeria. It's not on the blacklist, but it's a very high-risk country, So I would look at the gray list, which would include also, like for example, the INCSI list, which is a drug trading list of the United States. That's also a source of this one. I would look at the CPI, Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International. What's your level of corruption in the country? So lots of sources that I take into consideration when I want to risk rate a certain country or jurisdiction. So I don't rely only on blacklist. So it's not like a black and white, okay, blacklist is high, then the rest are low. No, it's not just that simple. I would, for example, put Colombia as high risk, Mexico as high risk, because, the drug trading and all this kind of things. Colombia, because of the black market pays to exchange, the BMP. So again, that will put it as high risk. The level of corruption, like for example, if you look at all the Arab Spring time, all the countries have been lowered in the CPI index. Currently now the UAE is the best on the CPI index, I believe 6.7 or 7.2, something like this, around this figure. No, I mean in the Arab countries. Arab countries, yeah. UAE I think is the best, the highest ranking, because that's the closest to 10. Because of course 10 is the best and 0 is the worst. So whenever you're closer to 0, that means you have a higher level of corruption. So after the Arab Spring, even those countries that were like 4 or 5, they lowered to 2 and 3, because when the Arab Spring happened, that showed that there are lots of corruption happening in the country. So of course, Transparency International lowered the ranking for the corruption at that time. So again, it's very dynamic. So you would need to monitor the blacklist, you need to monitor the gray list, you need to monitor the other information where the countries are classified as terrorist financing countries or drug dealing countries. Somalia, for example, all these issues in Somalia and pirates and corruption happening. So you need to look at all these kind of things. Yeah, it's not an easy task. The risk matrix is always a challenging job, and there are lots of inputs to be able to build the proper risk matrix. Yeah. Sometimes even the big banks, I'm sure that in HSBC you had more skill than this. So I myself, for example, in my banks, I follow low risk, then moderate low, then moderate high, then prohibited.
Yeah, sure.
Because again, from moderate to low, there is a huge gap, because low, I'm telling you, I'm exclusively allocating it to government organization. But not all customers are also moderate, Like for example, for me, an employed person versus a student. Student is a little bit lower risk. So where do I put him? I cannot put him with the government organization where I apply basic KYC. So I need to create another category where I call it moderate low. The housewife, for example. I would put it moderate low, right? So sometimes you would need to create a more sophisticated risk matrix, but this is the basic one. Like, this is from a regulatory point of view, it's acceptable.
Right, because see, what we did was more from a monitoring perspective, right? Like alerts generated, monitored entities, banks, whatever. So
Right.
it was a correspondent relationship that was being monitored
Right.
on an AML monitoring system.
Yeah.
There were only 3 risk classifications,
Yeah.
low, medium, high.
That's it.
That's it. Because obviously,
And most of the international AML systems operate like this, on a 3 scale.
3 scale.
Yeah.
Because obviously, as per their assumption or their understanding, prohibited is absolutely no, so that should not even reflect.
Yeah, it shouldn't be, because you will decline the relation, so he's not your customer.
Exactly, that is
Yeah.
not your customer
Yeah.
any which way. So you only have 3 classifications.
Classification, high, moderate, and low.
Yeah, and so you had businesses that were classified as low, moderate, high.
Yeah.
And then you had countries that were classified as low, medium, high.
That's right. True. Yeah. That's acceptable. As I said, like if you are new to risk assessment and if you don't want to complicate things, I strongly recommend the 3-scale approach, because that even will make it easier for you if you want to implement an AML system, automation. Because easily you do not need to map. Like for me, when I do that, if I could not customize the AML monitoring system, then I need to map. So the moderate low, I will again put it as moderate. Then the moderate high, half of them will go as moderate, half of them will go as high. So you would need again to make some mapping to be able to map what you have in the risk matrix with the AML monitoring system.
It's like the Likert scale.
Yeah.
And you have 3 only
Right.
levels, or
Yeah, or 5 or 6. I mean, depending. Some banks even do it like percentage, 0 to 20, then 21 to 30, then 30 to 40. So they have maybe 6 or 7 scales. It depends how sophisticated. As I said, if you are a simple bank, then 3 scale. If you are very sophisticated, very complicated, like I worked with some banks, like for example, the previous Ibn Amro, they had very complicated structures. So you could not apply a 3-scale approach. You need more than this, because the types of customer that you have, they are unique. So you would need to have some variations, because you would need to put different scenarios, and each scenario you need to apply a different threshold, and the due diligence will differ. So depending on the complexity of your customers, then you would choose what works best for you. Yep. So the MLCFT risk factors, it's geographical, customer, products and services. Yeah, okay. Again, this is in a very simple manner. If I want to complicate it further, I will split this into two because I will take into consideration the delivery channels. Because one certain product, depending on how you deliver this product, the risk rating also will differ accordingly. But as I said, if you want, again, to keep it simple, these are the three major elements for a risk assessment or a risk factor. So the summary of high risk factors, again, geographical, so whether it's a sanctioned country or not, that's your question, sanctioned country or not, whether this country lacks adequate AML, CTF regimes, terrorist funding countries or no, the level of corruption. That's why I told you we look at the blacklist, we look at the gray list, we look at the CPI or corruption perception index. That's geographical. Customer, what type of customer it is, whether it's DNFBB, financial institution, whether it's an onshore, offshore, PEP, gatekeeper, financial institution, high risk business, service provider, all these are high risk customers. Then we look at the product, private banking, offshore international activity, deposit taking facilities, wire transfer, cash management functions, where transactions where the beneficiary is undisclosed, so you have a problem in identifying the UBO, traveler checks, money orders, all these are high risk products or services, right? So that's in a nutshell or briefly how can we build a proper risk matrix and what are the proper risk factors. So FATF, as we mentioned yesterday or last week, recommendation number 1, assessing the risk and applying a risk-based approach. That's recommendation number 1. So the first recommendation. So risk-based approach, so FATF suggests a risk-based approach, risk-based monitoring, so that will entail a risk-based monitoring. When we risk rate the customers, as I said, many banks, I found this is a major issue, that they do the risk rating, but that's again on paper. Is that reflected on your core banking system? Is that reflected on your AML system? Again, are you making use of the information or not? It's not good enough for me to say, well, I have an Excel sheet that shows that this is the risk rating for my customers. Okay, is that Excel sheet tied up to your monitoring? No. So although you have a risk matrix, but you don't have a risk-based monitoring because you have not used that input to change how the monitoring will take place. So again, this is very important. Same like I gave you example last time when I said that I was in one conference sitting with regulators and I said, if you don't make use of your KYC information, you don't need to take it. Why? Because in both cases you will be fined. If I gather the KYC information, I don't make use of it, if it stays in box files, it's not reflected on my system, then I'll be fined from regulators. It's not satisfactory. So if I say that KYC is valid, that means I'm having proper means of collecting the KYC, then I have proper means of making use of this KYC information. It's not just staying in box files and it's not reflected on your monitoring procedures. So again, it's a complete cycle. We should not stop in the middle. You could do a great job. You can do a great foundation. You can put a foundation where you can build, let's say, a skyscraper like Burj Khalifa. But after you do this great foundation, then you build a parking, which is 2 floors. So that foundation should have been continued to do a great tower or a great, building. So you've done a great job in collecting the information, but you wasted your whole effort by throwing this information in box files and not making use of it. And that's the major thing that I find in banks. They think, many banks, they think that they have a risk-based approach. They think. But in fact, they don't. I asked them, where is your risk matrix? They showed me a risk matrix, which is Excel sheet. That's it. Okay. How are you making sure of this? How am I making use of this Excel sheet? Nothing. Oh, it's just we are risk rating our customer. Okay, so what? What's the next step? Does this affect your monitoring? No. They're monitoring all the customers the same way. So what was the benefit of risk rating them? If I'm going to monitor the PEP, same as the student, same as the housewife, same as the government organization. That's a major deficiency. So when we talk about a risk-based approach, we talk about a risk-based monitoring. Okay? So business, as I said, retail, loan, investment, etc. Customer, individual, corporate, PEP, trust. Product, loan, margin trading, cash. Delivery channel, electronic, mobile, banking, face-to-face, etc. So these are the 4 main elements I always look at. Where is the jurisdiction? What's the product and service? What's the type of customer? What's the delivery channel? So an AML customer risk model will provide a risk score based upon the risks associated with the combination of the customer type, products and services offered, geographies or jurisdictions where these products and services are offered, and the delivery channel. So the main pillars of the AML program, as we mentioned in the previous days, and I keep on repeating that because that's again very important in the exam. So policies, procedures and controls, compliance officer, training and awareness, independent assessment, independent audit, board of director oversight. Okay, question? Huh? You don't have that slide? Yeah, as I said, you will find some, but you will definitely have it in the material. Okay? Great. So we'll take now one by one. So what I'm doing, I'm going to take each and every element, and then I will start to emphasize and explain that. So the first element is internal policies, procedures, and controls. So you need to use a risk-based approach. Again, if that program is not a risk-based, for me, zero. I don't need to look further. Same like when we used to be an auditors. The first thing before, if we are getting a new client, we used always to do something called IT audit. What does the IT audit do before doing the normal audit? We need to assess the reliability of the systems of the bank. That means, can we rely on the reports generated from the systems or no? If I cannot rely, then my whole audit program will change. That means I cannot rely on controls. That means I need to do something else. So if the IT audit tells me that, well, the systems are reliable, so you can rely on the output of the system, then we can rely on the controls and we can do our audit in a different manner. So again here, when I look at the AML program, if I don't find the AML program is a risk-based program, I do not need to look further. What will I look at? Right? If, yeah, the heart of the system, the core element of the system is missing. Okay? So use of a risk-based approach provides sufficient controls and monitoring systems for timely detection of suspicious activity, providing for dual controls and segregation of duties, which is very important. So you always have to find a maker and a checker. You always need to find an audit function and a segregation of duties, comply with all record-keeping requirements, adequate supervision of employees who handle large currency transactions, complete record, grant exemptions, and of course, whenever there is any deviation from the policies and procedures, that needs to be explicitly and in writing mentioned. Why there is a deviation from the policy and procedure, and that should not be the standard. Policies are meant to be respected and followed and complied with. But there are certain situations, for example, where we need to do a deviation from the policy. Like, as I said, where you find a certain situation where it's not mentioned in the policy. Like, as I gave you an example last time when I was in the US, and I got a customer who lost his thumb, and I want to take a signature. That's not in my standard policies. So in this case, if the regulator, let's assume that he granted me the authorization that I can take the fingerprint. In this case, I'm putting in my identification policies that fingerprints are not accepted. But for that situation, because this guy, let's say he was a military guy and he was granted an exemption for this, due to that situation, then I can grant him an exemption based on the approval from the regulator. Then I would need to document that there was a deviation from the policy. But the deviation should not be the standard. That means some banks or some institutions, they have the policies and they don't follow it. There's always a deviation. So policies are meant to be respected. Deviations are there in certain scenarios, and that needs to be explicit. So I need to mention clearly why there was a deviation from the policy. So the standard is to comply with the policy.
The deviation needs to be covered with mandate from the regulator, or?
It depends what kind of deviation. It depends. As I said, there are certain deviations that would require an approval from regulator. There are certain deviations where it's not affecting any. I just give an example. But let's say, for example, let me give another example where it doesn't need regulator approval. Yeah, it could be, for example, for a certain jurisdiction, I would need to, for example, to keep a longer period. Or let's say, for example, a Saudi bank here, their policy is not to deal with walking by customers. Then that Saudi bank, you got a walking by customer who's a Saudi, who's a customer in the head office. then in this case I can create a deviation that I will do this as an exception to deal with walk-in by customer based on that this customer is a customer of my bank somewhere else. In this case, I do not need to get a regulator approval because it is my own internal policy that says, well, I do not need deal with walk-in by customer. Of course,
It shouldn't contradict with the regulator.
yeah, if it is contradicting, then I need to get a waiver from regulator. But if it's not a regulatory requirement, it's still my policy, then in this case, I need to explicitly document why there has been a deviation in the policy. Again, if you want to complicate things further, for example, in the board of director remuneration, for example, if you wanted this year to give them a little bit extra. So in this case, you are deviating from the remuneration policy. So you need to justify why. Oh, because they have done an extraordinary job this year. In the middle of the crisis, they drove the bank to a success, or they got the bank out of a crisis. So we will, exactly, or they made a substantial extraordinary profit. So in this case, we will deviate from the normal remuneration policy and we'll give them some extra remuneration because of their extraordinary efforts. So lots of examples for this. So adequate supervision of employees who handle large currency transactions, complete records, grant exemption, train employees to be aware of their responsibilities. This is very important, and this can be covered also in the corporate governance, where you need to set responsibilities. Without setting the responsibility, there will be a blame game. So who's responsible? So who did it? Why it happened? And all this kind of things. So if there is a responsibility, there is no blame. So when you set the responsibility, you set with it the accountability. So if the person is responsible for a certain area, that means he is held accountable for that area. So if there is something went wrong, and that's why in the US, they divide the AML function by functions. Like, you will not find an AML officer. You will find the KYC officer. You will find the sanctions officer. You will find an investigation officer. You will find the reporting officer. By function. But there is nothing called an AML officer who does everything. So if I have something wrong, or if I have a problem with the KYC, I will not go to any AML officer, I will go to the KYC officer. Why there has been a problem in the KYC. Sanctions officer, if they had any breach in the sanction, I need to go back to the sanctions officer. And that's why they divide it functional-wise, right? And that's, again, something very important because of the complexity of the role. They say that, well, you cannot be an AML officer who can monitor sanctions, KYC, investigation, reporting. You will not be focused, but I want you to be specified, or doing this area only, to be focused, more focused on it. And if there is something goes wrong, I know whom to go back to.
So this needs more staff.
It needs more stuff. That's why, of course, in the US, you will find the AML team is a huge team, of course, yeah. Implement screening programs to ensure high standards over customers and employees. Of course, we need to set, we mentioned that we comply with the regulatory framework. If you want to take a better step even, I'll comply with even the international best practice, which sometimes is higher than the regulatory framework. So in this case, I need to apply, make sure that I'm applying the best practices ever. They must be in writing and include senior management approval and overview of laws and regulations. And that's why, as I said, no policies and procedures can be issued without the sign-off from the compliance department. Why? Because they need to make sure that it is complying with the laws and regulations. That's, again, very important thing. I look at the bank-wide or the institution-wide policies and procedures. If the compliance did not sign off on it, then that's a breach. Because how did you ensure that these policies and procedures are in line with the laws and regulations if the compliance did not have a look, right? A definition of what constitutes suspicious activity and how to manage it. So again, what are the red flags, or what could constitute the suspicious activity, and how to deal with that. When I face this situation, what do I need to do? Procedures for reporting suspicious activity, and that's a major weakness in financial institutions based on our audits, that they can say, well, this is suspicious, but how to file a suspicious transaction report, the procedures, sometimes it is missing. And that's, again, could create lots of difficulties when you want to file an STR and you don't have a clear steps to do so, or procedures to do so. Procedures for responding to regulatory or law enforcement requests, which is very huge in the US because you get lots of law enforcement requests, as I mentioned, and as we will be discussing later on, subpoena, search warrant, restraint warrant, I mean, lots of requests you get from the regulatory authorities, then how to deal with such requests. A quality assurance program, so we need to make sure that we are abiding by quality assurance and there is high level of quality in all what we do, so that should be part of your internal policies, procedures, and controls. Compliance officer. Again, so now we are going to move to the second pillar. So now we finished the first pillar, which was internal policies, procedures, and controls. The second pillar is the compliance officer. Again, as I said, I do not expect just to see a person, but I need to look at his qualification. Is he qualified or not? What is his responsibilities? What is his communication skills? Okay? What is the compliance organization? What's the reporting line? Is there any conflicting function? Is he also the chief internal auditor? Okay? Delegation of duties. So how they delegate the duties and of the compliance, and what compliance approach is it? Let's say centralized compliance, decentralized compliance. All these things are among the evaluating factors of the compliance officer. So responsibilities for designing and implementing the program is the responsibility of the compliance officer. Making necessary changes and dissemination of the information about the program success and failures to key staff members. Constructing the AML CTF related content for staff training programs and staying current on legal and regulatory development in the field. These are all elements that we evaluate when we evaluate the compliance officer. So as I said, just having a compliance officer without this element, that's not gonna make you pass your examination. That means I need to look in these elements to be able to say, well, yes, that bank has a compliance officer. You got the point? So it's not just an officer, not ticking the box. Real compliance.
What do you mean here, compliance organization?
Whom they are reporting to, the staffing of the compliance department, their reporting lines, if they have any conflicting functions, like internal audit also, they are also compliance and audit. Okay, if they take any executive role, so they're doing some business. So all these things are part of the compliance organization. So now we finish the second element. Then the third element is training. And who to train, what to train on, how to train, when to train, where to train, why to train. So again, lots of questions. So again, the training program is not one size fitting all. So again, to design my AML training program, I need also to take all these elements into consideration. Again, we go to many banks and then I tell them, show me the training materials, for example, for your frontliners. Then you find the same training materials for everybody. But I need to make sure that the training materials are different because the functions are different. Even the frontliners, are they dealing with cash or non-cash functions? The training material should be different, right or no? So, whom are you training? What to train on? So, for example, are they new joiners? Is it a refresher course? What are you training them on? How to train?
What to train actually, we have in material also there is a questions on this one.
Yeah.
Especially what kind of training you have to give to
Exactly.
directors and management.
True.
So can you explain on these things?
Yeah. So as I said, when you assess the training, we need to look at the content of the training. Is it taking into consideration, for example, the latest updates? Is it touching on their responsibilities and also at the same time their rights? So rights and responsibilities. Is it in line with the regulatory framework? Is it showing them the regulatory framework or no? Let's say, is it taking into consideration what changes are happening in the field or not? Is it touching their job responsibilities, like their function that they are doing, or it's away from what they are doing? So all these are part of what to train, right? So, for example, I'm sure the central bank is putting a mandate, for example, like new joiners must be trained on AML. Then, for example, you are putting certain regulations that there should be a refresher course, let's say at least once a year. People need to be refreshed on the terms and so on. So our banks are following this. When you talk about new joiners, is it just once a year? So, for example, somebody joined in January, is he trained in December? So this 11 months is what he has been doing, without training. So normally that new joiners, they need to be trained as soon as they join. Then after that, let's say there is a refresher yearly, for example, to refresh their mind on what's happening in the industry, what are the latest changes in regulations and so on. So this is very important elements. As I said, the training is very critical. That's why we look at the content. It's not, again, ticking the box, not just, well, the organization is doing a training. One time I was invited to give a training for a whole bank in Saudi Arabia, and it was after SAMA finding. And I looked at the schedule and I was laughing. It was an AML training, and they wanted to train everybody. So they said, we need to finish this in 3 months, because literally SAMA was giving them 90 days to complete this. Otherwise, there's going to be something happening. And I looked at the schedule. I found the AML department 1 day, frontliners 1 day, everybody 1 day, then the IT 2 days. So I said, what are you going to train the IT department on AML, and why they need 2 days? And the compliance department, the AML department is only 1 day. Can you imagine? So it's just ticking the box, let's train. So they found, okay, let's put for those 2 days for IT. Can you imagine? This is something out of experience. So it shows that even the people don't understand the whole concept of it. What will you train IT for 2 days on AML? And the compliance, the AML people, they are training them 1 day. These are the people that need more time, right? So again, this is an example of just ticking the box. Okay, let's do training. So put everybody, let's train. Content, not important. Or sometimes they put different departments together. Like they put for you the frontliners with the treasury, with the LC department, with senior management all together. Okay, let's give a training. What kind of training? Is it just an awareness? I can understand, but is it just a focused training? Then how can I have all this function? What will the audit do with the frontliners, with the back office, all together in an AML training, if it is a focused specified training?
Actually, this one was the what to train. The question. Now the question will be what to train for a management.
Yeah.
So whether we have to do deep down training in AML safety, or just the basics of KYC and statistics are enough. So this is going to be a question. So if you can actually have a slide, suppose who to train. In the material, they exhaustively they discussed about this one, like 3 pages, 4 pages.
Yeah.
So actually, if you have a bullet point for this, it will be very good.
Okay, fine. I'll prepare one slide, and we will do it tomorrow. So I'll try to summarize it for you. Sure. Document all training, even informal training at staff meetings. The most funny situation I faced was one also when I was doing an audit, independent assessment. When I asked about the training records and everything, they said, well, I briefed people about the AML laws and regulations. Okay, that's informal, fine. But do you have any evidence for this? Do you have any documentation? No. Okay, I trust you. I want to trust you, but audit doesn't operate that way. I need to have an audit trail. I need to have an evidence. So I believe you. I'm not saying I'm not believing you, but without an evidence, for me, it didn't happen. I'm sorry. So document all trainings, even the informal trainings at staff meetings, etc. Ensure training is appropriate for target audience. And this is very important, the content of the training. Is it suitable for the audience or not? Okay? Provide training for the AML CTF officer and staff conducting independent audit and testing. These also need to be trained themselves. To train senior management and board of directors on AML CTF risks to the institution. So they need to know what are the risks that would affect their financial institution. That's essential element of their AML training content. Culture of compliance advisory by FinCEN. So leadership actively supports compliance, mitigate AML CTF risk not comprised by revenue interests, internal information sharing, adequate resources for AML CTF, independent testing by competent party, understand how STR reporting is used. So that's, again, as I mentioned, the compliance culture. As I mentioned, how to build this culture of advisory or compliance. 7 elements of an effective CDD program. Again, flashcard, you need to memorize that. So what are the 7 elements of the AML CDD program? Customer acceptance, customer identification, development of customer profile, assessment and grading of risks, ongoing monitoring, investigation, documentation. These are very important elements if I am to assess the CDD function in any financial institution. As I said, I'll build my audit or inspection program to test these 7 elements. Are they available or not?
So this is under which pillar? This is
لحظة go back. The one we have here is different.
No, موجودة بس.
Identification, no. Acceptance, it's not a
Yes.
the other way around.
I want this one is in the which pillar? Under which pillar? We have 4 pillars, right? Under international.
No, that will be part of the training, awareness. I mean, awareness, yes. Yeah. 3rd pillar. Okay? Beneficial ownership. So, for example, as I said, you have Corporation A, then you have Corporation B, which owns 80%, and you have Corporation C, which owns 20%. Under this, there are different, corporations or entities. So, are we able to identify the beneficial owner? So, in this case, let's say, how can we drill down to reach to the UBO or the ultimate beneficial owner, and how this task can be really very complicated. Complex structure, okay? So again, see how the structure can be complex. So it's not good enough to go and say, well, organization A, the beneficial owners are Corporation B and C, where Corporation B owns 20%, 80%, and Corporation C owns 20%. No, you need to drill down. So here, under this 80%, there is an 80 and 20, there is a 40 and 60 under this one. Then you need to reach to the we call them natural persons, not just entities. And we need to make sure that none of these people are on the blacklist. They are good guys. We are doing our due diligence on these people. So again, when we train people about CDD, we need to go to that level, not just, what's CDD? Oh, well, the Corporation A has Corporation B and C. They are the UBOs, and that's it. No, that's not good enough, and that's not sufficient CDD procedures. Suspicious or unusual transaction monitoring and reporting. An FI must have a risk-based system for monitoring and reporting suspicious activity to the Financial Intelligence Unit, FIU, using suspicious transaction reports, STRs. Most countries that require suspicious activity reporting prohibit disclosure of the subject. Of course, that's a very confidential thing, and it's exclusive for the FIU. Strong record-keeping procedures are key to managing regulatory and or legal requirements. There is no international clearinghouse for storing STRs. That's not available. The FIUs in various countries often publish summary reports analyzing STR trends, not analyzing the STRs itself, but the trends itself. That's why we require statistics to be able to know whether you are within the range or no. Let's say, for example, statistics for a country, STR trends, let's say, are increasing 25%. Have your STR trends increased? Let's say the average number of STRs in the first quarter are X. Are you within that range or you are far away? You can gauge yourself to know whether your quality of your STR is good or deficient. It can be 3rd pillar. It can be also part of the independent assessment. So it's mixed. So I'm just talking about the program. So if I'm taking it from a training perspective, yes, I need to train on this. If I'm taking it from an independent assessment, then I need to look at these elements in the AML program. Suspicious activity red flags. Red flags are indicators of potential suspicious activity and can be summarized into major categories including customer behavior, cash transactions, non-cash deposits, wire transfers, safe deposit box activity, credit transaction, commercial account activity, trade financing transaction, investment activity, employee activity, activity indicative of human trafficking or smuggling, terrorism financing. So again, if I'm going to provide that as a training, how to set up the scenarios, unfortunately, most of financial institutions, I don't want to be pessimistic, but most of them, they rely on the vendors to do their scenarios, which is the biggest mistake. Nobody knows your business better than you. Nobody knows your customer better than you. You are the best person to set the scenarios. Relying on the vendor's standard scenarios is not good enough.
Actually, I think most of them, what will happen, when they initially install the system, they do not understand this concept.
Exactly.
That's why they will ask the scenarios to be put first.
Yep.
But as the customer due diligence is ongoing,
Yeah.
they will be changing when during
Yeah.
the course of it.
That change itself can be a horrible situation because you could destroy the whole rest of the scenarios. You can put one wrong scenario because once the scenario starts generating alerts, you cannot delete these alerts. You are stuck with them, so you have to dispose of them. So if you put the wrong scenario, you didn't test it properly, and it generated a huge number of false positives, you have to face it. That's why we always...
It can always be modified every now and then.
Of course, yeah, but that's why we are saying if you are not qualified enough to do this job, better call for the vendor. That's why we always, whenever we do the implementation, by default, the initial scenarios, we put them as standard scenarios. Then after that, whenever you want to add anyone, it's a non-standard scenario. So when that destroys the rest, you cannot come and blame us as vendors that, your system is not functioning well.
I'll give you an example of this because back in ADC we had a system called Matrix.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the version we had was a very obsolete one.
Yeah.
Okay. However, one good thing it had was a backend, sort of an interface called Microsoft.
Uh-huh.
And Microsoft allowed you to make those changes.
True.
You could create thresholds, you could create scenarios,
Yeah.
which allowed you to have multiple conditions in place,
Yeah.
which would detect various kind of transactions and
Right.
generate alerts.
Yeah.
And whenever we felt there were a lot of unnecessary ones, we could always go around and change those.
Yeah, change or deactivate the scenario. If you can keep it, you don't need to delete it. You can just deactivate it. Yeah, yeah. So the thing here is that when you set these scenarios, it's not like you just sit with a cup of tea and then from the top of your head, okay, let's put scenario that way, let's put scenario that way. No, when I design the scenarios, I need to make sure. So I divide it like this. So let's say now I want to put scenarios for customer behavior. What are the scenarios for the customer behavior? After I finish that, I move to the next one. I need to put scenarios for cash transaction. So I make sure that I cover the major categories, not just sit, okay, let's put a scenario, customers with wrong information, customers dealing in cash, multiple people operating on the same account. What are you covering? You don't know. You just memorizing or whichever comes to the top of your head, let's put it. Whichever doesn't come, it doesn't exist.
Too many roundabout
Yeah.
transactions.
Exactly. So all the things. So when we do the scenario writing, we actually make sure that it covers the major areas that it should be covering, so that we don't leave any risk not mitigated. So the scenario here is like a control for the risk. So it's not an easy job, as I said. If you're not qualified enough, then you will mess around. And if you have the best system in the world with poor scenarios, the system will be useless. So going into automated AML CTF systems, information technology can be used to support the AML CTF defenses in the following areas: customer verification, sanction watch list filtering and screening, transaction monitoring, automated regulatory reporting, case management, audit trail. So these are major elements where the technology can really step in and provide a great support and a great regulatory help. You need to determine appropriateness for the financial institution. There is no best system, as we mentioned, but there is best system for you. So what is the best system that would be suitable for me? And the rules or functionality are risk-based. So any system now which is rule-based, not risk-based, is not acceptable anymore. So there is no silver bullets. That means there is no best system. You cannot just say, oh, well, Mantas is the best or SAS is the best. There is no best system, but there is a best system for my organization. So whether you want to build your own system, buy one, I don't really care. The most thing that I care for is your system functioning properly. Is it doing exactly what it's supposed to do or not?
يعني السلايد رقم 26.
Okay. So, to summarize that, automated system should be risk-based. They should take into consideration KYC management, name checking, online, offline filtering, which is a blacklist checking, account profiling, risk modeling, business intelligence, transaction monitoring, alert rules, workflow, STR management, red flags, lots of components of the AML monitoring system. Okay? Then we go to the independent review, independent audit. Assess the overall integrity and effectiveness of the AML CTF compliance program, including risk assessment. Okay? CDD policies, transaction monitoring, training, MIS, management information system, case management and investigation process, sanctions training process.
Actually, this
238.
all, you see, if you see, these are there in previous also. Again, so it is.
I'm repeating that because I put it from two perspectives. You can
The perspective of the
Yeah.
compliance officer will be different and the ingredient.
exactly. That's why I put it twice, like as a part of a training, as a part of the assessment. So if I'm looking at it from an assessment, is it covering these areas? If I'm putting it from a training, is the training, because you need to train also those who will perform the independent assessment. So are they trained on this or no? That's why you will find it in your materials doubled. It's intentionally doubled. It's not because if you look at it from the training, that needs to be looked as a part of the training program. If you look at it from the independent assessment, if I want to do an examination on the independent assessment, I need to make sure that they cover these areas. You got the point? You understand the perspective? That's why when our colleague asked, which pillar are we? Are we in the training or are we in the independent assessment? I said it can be both, depending on which angle you are looking from. Okay? So this is regarding the independent review. And of course, a proficient audit of an AML compliance program should ask many questions. Of course, when we prepare our audit checklist, are proper records being maintained? Are SARs, STRs properly filed in a timely fashion? Is proper identification being requested from customers and verified? Are high-risk accounts being reviewed regularly? I don't want to go through all that, but again, when you design an audit program, you have an audit checklist where you need to follow, so you will not miss out on any certain element in the audit.
I think we go on just go to the previous slide.
This one.
The previous slide.
Previous?
Yeah. Here, it means to say that the independent review, when the independent auditor is conducting the review,
Yeah.
has to cover this area.
Exactly. That's right.
And this is assigned to an outsider or with the
It can be an internal audit, it can be an outsider. It's all up to you. So if your internal audit are not qualified enough to do that, then you need to outsource it to an outsider.
Not only that, but
And-
based on the management recommendation, they
Yeah.
say that the external auditor view also they want.
They want to have. Sometimes they do both. Like when I used to be head of compliance, sometimes I was audited by the internal audit and also by an outside auditor, both of them. Not the annual audit, not the financial audit. So they got, for example, let's say E&Y to do for me an independent assessment. They got our internal audit department to do for me also an independent assessment. They wanted to know the internal audit department and they wanted to know also the view of an external party. That can be done. Okay? So one or two or both. Okay? So the factors to evaluate, you need to evaluate the success. As I mentioned at the beginning, are we meeting the objectives or no? STR, SAR trends, potential abuse and preventative measures, sharing of information with employees, reporting results, training, audits. So now we're going to discuss Know Your Employee, KYE, or the enemy within. So suspicious employee activity. A criminally co-opted bank employee might and would facilitate money laundering. There is a great percentage of criminal activity are related to insiders. Knowing a potential enemy within is as crucial as knowing your customer and other outsiders. Understand an employee's background, conflict of interest, and susceptibility to money laundering. So that's a very essential thing where the background check is very essential to consider. So I gave you, it can be done through different ways. At the employee onboarding at the hiring stage. We normally, if there is an exam, we put some questions that shows the level of ethics. Of course, you don't ask him straight, are you ethical or not? But let's say we give him like a case study where it has some conflicts, and we ask him, what would you do in certain situation? It will give us some indication. Yeah, first of all, we need to screen him. As I said, a blacklist. Then certain questions in the exam or in the interview to see how his response to certain scenarios where it can give an indication of his ethical standards. So that's at hiring stage. Then once he is hired, once he is on board, then we need to look at the employee red flags, which we will be discussing in the next slide, where it will show that there is an indication for susceptibility to money laundering or not. So some red flags: employee exaggerating their credentials, background, or financial ability. Again, this is one of the main red flags that we would face. Employee frequently involved in unresolved exceptions. Employee living a lavish lifestyle that could not be supported by his or her income and salary. Employee avoiding taking vacations or taking minimal vacations. Employee frequently overriding internal controls. Employee using company resources to further private interests, so misappropriation of assets, which is a fraudulent act. Employee assisting transactions where the identity of the ultimate beneficiary or counterparty is undisclosed. Again, this is a red flag. So when we talk about suspicious activity red flags, we need to look at customer behavior, customer ID, cash transaction, non-cash deposits. Again, as we mentioned before, we look at, again, if you add more, we would add also employees. So number 10 here, we can put employees as well.